Good morning, and thank you for joining this month's GP Tips and Tricks webinar on Integration Manager and Two-Source Integration. I'm Dee Bowers, and I'll be your moderator. So before we get started, I'd just like to go over how to use the webinar pane. So on the right side of your on the right side of your monitor, you should see an orange arrow. You click that arrow, you'll be able to toggle the webinar pane between the open and closed position. We also have a small chat window. Feel free to enter your questions in throughout the presentation, and we'll answer those at the end of the session during our Q&A portion of the webinar. Now is a great time to check audio settings too, so if you could just take a moment and make sure you've selected the right option. If you've dialed in on your telephone, please make sure you've selected the Use Telephone option. Alternatively, if you're using your computer, please make sure you've selected the Use Mic and Speakers option. So on that note, I also want to say that this webinar is being recorded. We'll be sending out a link to the slide deck and the recording within 48 hours, so if you're interested in taking a look at this webinar again, just keep your eye out for that email. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's presenters. First, we have Megan Fall, who's a senior consultant with our Dynamics GP practice. Megan has over 6 years of experience with Dynamics GP, and she's also a Microsoft certified professional in GP financials, supply chain, and implementation. And I'm also pleased to introduce Sahar Ahmed, who's a consultant within our GP practice here at Armanino. Sahar has years of experience supporting and implementing Microsoft Dynamics GP. She's also a Microsoft certified professional in GP financials, inventory, and order processing. So it's great to have you guys both here. I know we have a lot to cover, so with that I'm going to turn the presentation over to Megan.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining. Just a brief overview of today's agenda. We are going to go through the slides fairly quickly to get to the demo and have as much time as possible for the demo. After we get back from the demo, we will go over the common errors and an additional series of tips and tricks. So to begin, what exactly is a two-source integration? When we speak of two-source integrations, we're talking about transactions. And this would be journal entries, receivables, invoices, payables, invoices, checks, cash receipts, anything that's a transaction. It's considered a two-source because you have header information and you also have distribution information. So as you know, when you enter a journal entry or a cash receipt or an invoice, you have a header portion which you fill out, which is generic, and then you have the distribution information, which is the account numbers and the debit and credit amounts. So those are considered two different sources. There are integrations that do use more than two sources. This would be things like sales orders can be more than two sources, but that is beyond the scope of this demonstration, and we will not be getting to that just yet. For the purposes of this webinar, just as an example, we are using a receivables invoice import as the demonstration. So we will continually speak of the receivables transactions. However, just remember that the format and the process is the same no matter what type of transaction you're doing. Just the individual elements such as the fields would be slightly different if it's a payables transaction or a journal entry or a receivables transaction. But the system is the same. Okay, so there's general steps. Step one, you want to review your transaction entry window just to go over your fields and just make sure that you include everything that you need. Then you're going to take that information, put it into a template in Excel, and once you've laid it out, you're going to save a copy as a CSV file. So we tend to recommend that you have a master file, which is an XLS Excel file, and then you overwrite your CSV each time. And the CSV is the one that's actually going to be used by Integration Manager as the source file. That leads us to step 3, which is in Integration Manager, you're going to create the integration and you're going to create the source objects. So you need 2 source objects, one for the transaction header information and one for the transaction detail information. The query relationship is the newest item that's going to be added to your Integration Manager setup. It only pops up when you have a source or more than one source for the integration. It will pop up and it will say this is required. You just simply click OK and then open up the relationship to link the header source to the detail source. And then of course you're going to do your destination mapping. Okay, so this is just a brief summary of what you're going to see on the transaction entry window. Again, as we said, the demonstration is for receivables transaction, so that's what we're going to show you here. What I have outlined in red, those are required fields that you have or have to include, so that would be the customer ID, the batch, the document date, and the sales amount. A note for batch ID, if you decide you do not want to include it in your source file, you can set it to be an input, which means at the time you run your integration, it's going to request that you enter a batch ID. So if you prefer that method, you absolutely can do that. However, a batch ID is required in some form during the integration. And then anything outlined in green, those are fields that will default from selections made by GP. So GP will default the document type. It defaults to invoice. If you want to import something different than invoice, you need to include the document type field. The number is another thing that GP will simply take the next available number for each transaction that you're importing. So you don't have to include transaction number in your source file. And then the related customer information, such as the address ID, currency, payment terms, etc. Those all default from your customer ID selection and so do not need to be included in the integration file. You can include them if you want, but they're not required. And then just simply don't forget, you want to also check your distributions page because there are required fields on the distribution page as well. Okay, and then now that you're on to creating your source file, as we stated, you're going to have header information and distribution information. For simplicity's sake, I always recommend that you group the header information together. I usually put that first on my document because it will remain the same within the same transaction. It will be identical. Pretty much you pretty much have to do a 2-line transaction for each transaction that's going to be in your file. So you're going to have 2 lines in the Excel file per transaction. The header information is going to be the same for both lines. The detail, the distribution information is what's going to change because you're going to have 2 distribution account numbers and that one's going to be a debit and one's going to be a credit. So that's why you have 2 lines. So then I've just simply outlined for you some of the standard header fields that you should include and just some notations on these. I'm not going to read through them, they're for your reference later on. We will show all of that, of course, in the demo, so don't worry, you will get to see it. And then step 3, when you create a new transaction integration, I label mine something like RMTRX just for simplicity. You'll see that one of our tips is that the shorter the naming convention, the better. If you want to call it receivables transaction, that's fine too. We just generally, say shorter is better. And then for the objects, again, you're going to have to create 2 objects. They are linking to the same source file. So you're using one CSV file, but 2 source objects within Integration Manager. And again, I'll show you how that works in the demonstration. Then you're going to go and select your destination, which is the receivables transaction entry window. You're going to enter your query relationship, and then you're going to map the fields from your source file to the destination. And I've put an example screenshot of the Excel file down below, just showing you how I've grouped the header fields and the distribution fields. And as you can see, the header fields are the same for both lines, but the distribution fields are what changes and makes each line unique. Okay, and with that, on to our demo. Okay, so just to let you know that this is actually GP 2013 R2, and R2 has added this ribbon across the top, so things will look slightly different than you're used to, but everything, the functionality is all the same. So we're going to start by reviewing our transaction entry window. As you can see, GP defaults to using the sales invoice. If we click in, it just gives us our number. You can add a description if you like. I'm going to say test transaction. And your batch ID is whatever you want to call it. From there, we just simply add our customer, Adam Park. I'm just simply doing this so that you can see how things default. So as I selected the customer ID, everything else in this section populated, so I don't need to include that in my integration. And then as I go, let's say $500 and tab off of that, and then I can click my distributions, and we actually get an interesting additional piece of information. So Adam Park has defaults entered for a good number of accounts. The ones that we care about are the sales account and the receivables account. Those are the two we care about. The tax information and the commission information, GP will default those. So if you have taxes being used, if you have commissions being calculated, those will be defaulted. All you need to do is bring in your sales line and your receivables line, and that does the rest. And GP does the rest for you. Okay, so I'm going to delete that because we're going to pull in basically the same transaction in our integration. So from here, utilizing these fields, we're going to then look at what our master file looks like. So as you can see, I've got one file that says RM import master file, which is an XLSX file. This is where I make my changes, where I add new transactions needing to be imported. The RM import CSV file, that's the one that Integration Manager is looking at. So every time I set up a new import, I'm going to add it to the RM import master and then save as RM import CSV, which overwrites the source file. And that way I'm not making changes to the file that's linked to Integration Manager, which is another thing we don't want to do. Okay, so opening up the Excel file, you can see that I've grouped my header information here. I have the doc date because I don't need the transaction number. I'm sorry, I have the batch ID as well. It just was hidden. So I'm bringing my batch ID in directly within the import file. I then include a doc date, the description, customer ID, and the transaction amount. And as you can see, I've duplicated this. So if I had two transactions, let's just do that. Let's just go ahead and add another set of transactions. So I'm going to keep the date the same, the batch the same. I'm going to keep the description the same. And even the customer. I'm going to go ahead and keep the customer the same too. But what I'm going to change is the amount. So now he's got an additional $100 that I'm pulling in. Okay? So GP is going to look at this, or Integration Manager is going to look at this, and it's going to see that there's one transaction for 590 and one transaction for 100, because all of these have to be the same in order for it to be considered the same transaction. So by changing only one field, I've told it that that's a unique set of data and should be given its own transaction. I'm actually going to even reuse these same account numbers because those are standardized for this customer. Now, also something that you'll notice, the distribution type. Now, when we opened up the GP distributions, we saw that it says sales distribution type and receivables distribution type, or RECV, I think was what the designation was. But for Integration Manager, those are numeric fields. You have to translate it into the numeric values that are those distribution types. The way you would want to do that, let me just get through this and I will show you how to find out what those distribution types map to. So this is where I'm going to go 0, 100, and 0, 100, and 0. Okay, so now that I have updated it, I'm going to save my Excel file, and then I'm going to do Save As, Desktop, change this to CSV right here, select my RM import, and save to overwrite it. Yes, I know it exists. That's fine. Yes, that's fine. Okay. All right, so now that I'm done with my source file, no, we just did that, so that's fine. Okay, on to Integration Manager. So first stop, if you look under Objects and you go to Destination Adapters and you go to the Receivables section and the Receivables Transactions, under Properties, you can look at the fields, and this tells you every field that is in any way connected to the receivables transaction. The one that we care about is the distribution type. So under Distribution section, we're looking at Distribution Type. You can then click Properties again. That tells you it's a required field because it says True. And then under Other Information, you get the list. These are the types as seen in GP, and then here's the numeric value. So you can see that 3, as I had in my file, 3 is the receivables transaction code, and if we go down, sales translates to 9. So that's why I have 3 and 9 as my distribution types in my source file, because that's what GP needs to see. Okay, so that's how to find that information. So the next thing that you're going to do is you have to create 2 source files or source adapters. So we would go under Source Adapters, ODBC Text, and Text, and then click on Define New. I've already done this, so I'm just going to bring up the ones that I was working on, which I have here, and actually apparently I've done this a couple of times. So I have the RM detail and I have RM header. So if we look under here, you can see I've mapped it. I've just simply used the ellipse to go find the CSV file, open, and I've told it that it's the comma separated file and that my first row is the column names. I then hit apply, and you can check your columns and just verify that it is showing the column names, that there are no blank columns at the end, and all data types should pretty much all be string. Another thing to do, because this is the RM header, this is where we want to tell it that only specific information is considered header information, and we need it to group by that header data. So we go to the Sorting tab under Group By, and we add, and just simply through a drop-down menu, you add only the fields that are part of the header, which ends at amount. This is why it's easier if you group them on the source file in order and start with the batch, or not the batch, but the header information first, and then have the detail information later off to the right. It just makes it much easier when you're doing the group by and the sorting. So everything past amount is the distribution information. It should not be included in the header. So if you look at my list here, I have batch, I have doc date, description, customer ID, and amount, and that's it. This blank line is fine because it's the asterisk. So that designates my sorted header source file. So this one is important. The detail one is very simple because you just let everything go in and you don't have to do the sorting. Once you hit OK, it's going to pop up this message, which is perfectly normal, and it just simply says that there are fields that are not currently being included in the group by list, which is correct. That's exactly what we want. We say OK, and it goes away. And then when you create your detail It's the same process, except you don't have to go to the header, to the sorting field. You just simply go out and find your file, tell it that it's a comma delimited and that the first row is columns, or is column names, and then just verify that there are no additional blank column names or columns listed below. If something comes up and you need to go back and make a change to either the column name or you're adding a column, you do want to make sure that you come back into the source and click refresh columns before you try to import. Otherwise you could get errors or you'll just get missing data. But as you can see, if I go to sorting, I don't have anything under the group by for the detail because I want to include all data. Okay, so that would be creating the source files. I've already created this integration. Right here, I've created it as RM import. And the reason I'm skipping over the process of actually creating this is because we did go over that in part 1 of this series. But it's also much more straightforward because you're simply naming the integration and everything else you're just allowing to default. You only want to use insert only. That's the option for integrating transactions. And I tend to leave the maximum number of errors and warnings at 10 so that I don't get through 100 of them before I end up having to go back and fix something. If I keep it at 10, then it's quick. If I need to change something, I can just find out very quickly. Okay. So you'll see the query relationship has shown up here. If I double click on it, I can open it up and you can see this is the list of the header data, and then you can see the list of the detail data. I have decided that the links need to be, for me, on the doc date, the description, and the customer ID. Those are the things that should translate between the two. You can select all of them if you wish, but I feel that the 3 that are selected here are perfectly adequate to get your transactions in properly. Okay, on to the destination mapping. So we've selected the receivables transaction, which again, just so you know, if you right click on destination, say add destination, it will allow you to browse out and find receivables transaction. So destination mapping. Okay, so the only two that we need to worry about are the main receivables transaction section, which is your header. So this is another way that we group things together. Let me just expand these a little bit so it's easier to read. But as you can see, all of these information is part of the header that we talked about. So the description, batch ID, doc date, customer ID, and if you scroll down, the amount. Those are your header pieces of information. And then if we go to distribution, these are all in our detail. And you can see that we've gone to option. We've told it to use the record, use the source record set, and we've specified that the RM detail is the location of all of the distribution information. So that's another way that we sort things out, is that the header, everything coming from the header source goes to the receivables transaction main list, and then anything in the RM detail source goes to the distribution section. Okay, so I showed you the option for the resource, the record source for the distribution. So that's the first option that you need to make sure you select. Under receivables transaction, under options, the one that you need to worry about is missing batch. It starts off as cancel document, which would mean, if you left that as is, what that would mean is that if you import the batch and the batch is not already created in GP, it will error out. So we want to change it to say add new batch, which means that the batch will be created during the process of the import. And so that's your best option. If you don't do that, you'll very quickly see error messages that say the batch does not exist, and then you know to just go back and do that. So something else I wanted to show you is that The normal process is simply to use the ellipse, go in, and select. What you'll see is you also get this extra drop-down menu where you can toggle between the two source files. This is again where you'd want to make sure that when you're putting information on, I'll minimize that guy. When you're putting information on the main, it's not easy to look at, the main receivables transaction section, that it's coming from that, that header transaction source. And when you go in here and you do your lookup, you would want to switch it to the detail and then select. Okay, so that's the difference. It's slightly more complicated on the mapping. Okay, so once everything is all set, you can preview your sources. So if you preview the header, you'll see we have 2 transactions, 2 lines. So it's telling us that there are 2 headers, which means there's 2 transactions. So that's perfect. Then if you go into the detail, this shows you everything. This shows you all 4 lines because all 4 lines have unique items on them. Okay, so this is exactly what we want to see, and we're ready to test our import. So to import, you just want to make sure that all fields are all windows in GP are closed, which we do have. Perfect. And then we click Run. And you'll get the progress bar, which comes up. And once it's thinking, all right, perfect. So we have successfully integrated 2 transactions. So now, if we jump into GP and we go down to receivables batches. Sorry, it took me a second to find that one. And we look at our test 1. You see, oh, I didn't delete that other transaction. So if I go and look at my transactions, there we go. So in this particular instance, you can see that transactions for Adam Park are defaulting to tax, which GP did all on its own. We didn't have any kind of tax information in our import. So you can see the defaults for GP work with Integration Manager. And if I look at the distributions, it looks like it came in as, oh, that's unfortunate. Well, we'll have to go back and double check on that one. But the main thing I wanted to let you see is that the tax is going to come off of GP whether or not we include it in the integration. So you don't have to worry about that too much. Okay, so not a perfect demonstration, but sort of an on the fly. So that's pretty much our demonstration. And we'll go back and we'll look at a couple of quick tips and tricks and some common errors. All right, so generalized troubleshooting information. You just want to, again, make sure that GP windows are closed before you run the integration. You don't want to have your source file, meaning the CSV file, and the integration open at the same time. They can, if somebody's adding or modifying the source file while it's being run, that can cause some problems, so we don't want you to do that. And then you just want to refresh your columns in your source and make sure that all the boxes are checked for the columns that you want to be integrating. If you start getting messages saying that fields are null or that you cannot import a 0 value, then you probably have some fields, some rows at the bottom that are blank and just need to go in and remove the 0 fields or the null fields. And then our favorite is the ADO field is nothing. This one, unfortunately, is one of the worst error messages simply because it can mean almost anything. It's not a very good error message because it doesn't really have anything to do with an ADO field. There is never an ADO field. So that one requires a little more troubleshooting, and generally speaking, it's almost faster if you just want to recreate or create a new source file or a new integration. Usually that ends up being the faster option. Okay, some additional tips. Let's see, we've gone over the first one. So the distribution tab, just if you have your customers all set up with default account numbers, then you can select to use default record set. So that would be in the distribution, in the mapping portion, in the distribution section, on options. You would, instead of saying use source record set, you would say use default record set. So that's just a drop-down menu selection that you can make. However, if not all of the distributions accounts are set as defaults for customers, you can get some missing data issues and such if you use that. And when you do that, then your transaction integration will actually become a single source file, because all you need is header information at that point. The distributions are all predetermined. Also, then we would say, just reiterating, to use the sort option, the sort field, to group the header files. And just a note that Integration Manager is picky about naming. And sometimes if you try to use field names that have spaces in them, if you noticed on my source file, all of the names, things like customer ID, there's no space. I just said CUST-ID, cust ID. It's all one word, because you want to minimize the number of spaces that you have in field names, file names, and the file path. Everything should be as short as possible. Integration Manager is kind of picky sometimes, and we've actually seen integrations fail for no other reason than there were too many folders for it to go through to find the source file. So just something to be aware of. All right, and with that, questions?
Thank you, Megan. So we've had a couple of questions come through. One of them being, will an integration work if there is only one relationship link set up between the header and the line? And as we saw, Megan did go ahead and show us in that relationship setup that there were a couple of links that she chose. She didn't choose to do the entire links between the header and the distribution. She did a couple of them. So in order to get the integration to work, yes, you do need at least one relationship link between the header and the line. Let's see. This is actually another good one that actually came through. Why do my colleagues and I have different integrations? Is there a way to make the integrations available to everyone? This is actually a very common issue that comes up on our help desk. What happens is a new user is set up on a new workstation, and they notice that when they open their integration manager, it doesn't have the same integrations that somebody else has. What that is basically within Integration Manager, under Tools and Options, there's a path that is set up. If your path is pointed to your C drive, which is local, that's going to make your integration sets to your local workstation, meaning that if you go ahead and set up a new integration, nobody else is going to be able to see it. It'll only be restricted to you. So it's best, and it's best practice actually for Microsoft, for everybody to be actually pointed to a shared location. Now this gets a little bit more complicated. If you have a couple of users that are pointed to a shared location and you have a couple that are not pointed to the share, we can actually assist in copying over those integrations. So if you do need assistance with that and moving some of the local integrations to a shared location, you can go ahead and contact us and we can assist with how to do that. And that wraps it up as far as questions go. Okay, great. Well, thank you guys for joining us. If you have any more specific questions, in the meantime, feel free to contact Megan or Sahar directly. We have their information right up on the screen right now. And again, we'll be sending out a link to this recording and our slide deck within 48 hours, so watch for that. And then as you exit the webinar, if you could just take a moment and let us know how we're doing. There'll be a quick survey. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks so much, and have a great afternoon.